Hello, this is Robert Rickover. I'm an Alexander Technique teacher in Omaha, Nebraska. And my guest today is Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. And Imogen's going to actually interview me on the topic, which is inhibition as a perhaps sophisticated form of outsourcing. Or I think for Europeans, maybe the term outsourcing isn't used as much. Delegating, assigning a task to someone else, that kind of thing. That's what we're talking about. Imogen?
Yeah. Okay. I'm in charge now.
You're in charge now. Yeah.
So why don't you start? I know you've been thinking about this a lot. Why don't you kind of lay out how things are designed to work? So.
Right. Well, this is my understanding of how they're designed to work. And I think it is supported by neuroscience. But bear in mind that neuroscience is still in its infancy, and things are in the brain, things aren't as sharply delineated as they might be in other areas. So, but it is the model, I think the basic model of how our brain and bodies interact is that the conscious part of our brain, which is our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain right above our eyes, basically in that area, it's really good at coming up with plans and strategies and things that it would like to see happen. And one of the things it's good at doing is delivering Alexander Technique directions, all kinds of directions. Doesn't even really matter for this discussion which kind of Alexander direction you as a teacher, for example, are using. The same basic principle.
But it's that part of the brain that's delivering the message. Basically.
Yeah, the conscious brain.
Yeah.
And then it's up to the rest of your brain and body to implement that. Most of your brain operates outside of your consciousness, and then your spinal cord is part of that, and the nervous system, and so on. The vast majority of what goes on when you put out a direction is coming from that unconscious part of your brain. And I'm just going to call them C and U occasionally to just distinguish them. Conscious, unconscious.
Unconscious, got it.
C and U. And I'm laying this all out because this distinction is basically the field on which this whole discussion is going to be taking place. This division of I won't say effort, but division of responsibility.
Okay.
And the first thing that kind of I think is worth saying is that what the conscious brain needs to do to put out an Alexander Technique direction is pretty simple. It just has to either have figured out or heard from a teacher or read in a book or just experimenting with a direction. It could be I'm free, it could be my neck is free, it could be whatever, doesn't really matter. And that's all it does. It just says, oh, this is what I want. Now, it does need to deliver that in an efficient way, which means no screaming at yourself, no yelling at yourself. It needs to be very soft. Basically, you're just saying, this is what I would like. That's it. Rest of you, the rest of the unconscious part, take it away and make it happen. That's really all the conscious brain has to do. The majority of what goes on as a result of that comes from the rest of your brain, the rest of your body. Way more than is going on in your conscious brain.
Right.
That's a really, I think it's an important distinction. And there's another, it's not just that your unconscious brain is really doing most of the work, as it were. But it's more than that, because it doesn't just take the direction in a naive way at face value. So for example, if you say, well, my neck is free, that seems like a good thing to ask for. It doesn't say, okay, we'll just free his neck and leave the rest of him alone, because it knows through its own internal wisdom that's not really such a great idea.
I don't know if it's even possible, actually.
Because it is impossible and certainly not sustainable. And it knows very deeply that everything is connected with everything else. And so you have to, it's not just blindly following this simple instruction. You got to make some judgment calls. And well, I won't go into details about how that can manifest itself, because we have talked about that in other podcasts. But the thing is that even though most of what goes on is going on at an unconscious level, we tend not to really appreciate that, precisely because it's unconscious. We sort of take it for granted. And, I think most people think of intelligence, it's sort of associated with conscious brain activity. Mm-hmm. A person is considered intelligent if he can make a good argument about something or knows certain things. But the intelligence of the rest of the brain and the body, which you might want to call body intelligence, kind of doesn't get the attention, I think, that it deserves. So that's kind of a part of what feeds into what I'm going to be talking about. I think you have a question.
Well, my question is more to do with what you've described seems more about direction, although I can definitely see how inhibition comes in.
Well, we haven't quite got to inhibition yet.
Okay, so this is just
we're just talking about like sort of standard Alexander technique, self-direction technology handed down.
So that's how the giving of directions is designed to work. There's this bit of your conscious brain that gives the direction. The most of what happens is unconscious, and that we don't appreciate that because it's not conscious. Is that it in a nutshell?
Exactly. There are two things, one that leads to the other. And there might be feedback back to the conscious brain. It's not like these parts are completely isolated.
No, it's all
So the wiring in the brain is very complex, and stuff goes in all directions. But just as an overall take on it, there is this distinction.
So it sounds fairly simple in principle, right? The actual
principle, it's incredibly simple. All you have to do is have a direction that you perhaps know from previous experience is useful, and you just deploy it without any particular effort, and suddenly something nice is likely to happen. That's really
what could possibly go wrong.
What could go wrong? Well, it turns out that using this interface well presents some very serious challenges. And the first one, I would say, or maybe even the main one, is that the conscious brain, in order for this to work, the conscious brain needs to stay out of the way of what the unconscious part of you is going to do in response to your thought.
Right.
Seems simple.
We don't like to give up that control, do we?
No. Most everybody, and I certainly include myself, have are very strongly tempted to want to help out a little bit. Could be it could be in very subtle ways, or it could be in less subtle ways, but there's the temptation to help is huge.
Right.
And
so when you're saying that, you mean, for instance, if you were using the direction that you mentioned earlier, my neck is free,
sure.
that you might try and free your neck, you start fiddling around, and
That's certainly a possibility. Or here's even another one. My neck is free and things get better, and I notice that, and I'm real interested in that.
Yeah.
Or yesterday I used it and a certain thing happened that was great. So part of me is kind of anticipating that today. And there are even more subtle ways. I mean, there's levels of subtlety that go very deep. And all of those things, interferences, even the most subtle, get in the way of the process.
Right.
And this is something that Alexander himself was very aware of, as were all, as far as I know, all of his senior teachers. I have quotes from Alexander where he said, and he's quoted by George Trevelyan on his first training course. And he says, the trouble is none of my pupils will believe that all they need to do is think, and that the wish for the neck to be free, and he's using that as an example, all they need to do is think that the wish for the neck to be free will do the trick. But they're all so brutalized by their belief in doing and muscular tension. He later says somewhere that we're slaves to our muscles. And he's saying that's a problem. He's up against himself. And he didn't really quite know what to do with it. Later on, his niece, Marjorie Barlow, in her book, An Examined Life, says, she quotes Alexander as saying, giving directions is an exercise in finding out what thinking is, what just thinking and nothing else is. He says, she says, we're always inclined to think, she says, but we need to send a direction, not try to implement, not try to carry it out, not even, and these are her words, not even a teeny weeny bit. We're always inclined to think, oh, well, just a little bit, just give it a little nudge. And a lot of that's not very conscious, actually, the degree to which we are helping it along or trying to help it along. Otherwise, we'd stop. But it is a blind alley. These are all her words. So she was very clear about that.
Actually, another challenge, because the trying to help part might be unconscious as well as
we're so used to it.
I think that's more of a habit.
It's a habit.
Yeah.
And Walter Carrington, I just want to give a couple of these quotes, because he said lots of pupils wish the up to happen, but since they don't really set much store on the wish, they will just do a little bit just to make sure, just to be on the safe side. They'll introduce just a little bit of doing. That's pretty nice, right? And Marjorie Barstow didn't dress it quite that way, but she did say that constructive thinking is incredibly simple. She said it's too simple. She would say, you people just don't believe how simple it is. she didn't say it was easy, but she said it
No.
was simple. So
Yeah.
I think there's kind of, I would say, pretty universal understanding by FM and first generation teachers, and I assume a lot of second, third, whatever generation teachers,
Yes.
that this is an issue. Now, I think a lot of it is I think we, to use a modern term, we want to all be influencers. We want to be kind of in charge of the outcome at some level. And
Yeah.
we want to stay involved. We may even just want to check in to make sure it's going okay.
That being in control, feeling in control. Yeah.
Right. So Alexander in his books talks about the importance of us learning to operate on a conscious plane, using our conscious brain. But I think he came to realize that just telling people that wasn't just enough to make it happen. I mean, it is true. We should be operating on a conscious plane to decide what to do or what to think. Mm-hmm. But we have to be really vigilant not to interfere with the manifestation of that.
Yeah, that we realize the limits of the conscious part, and we know this is the conscious part, the rest.
Yeah.
It is really challenging in practice, especially at first, because it's not how we're used to doing anything. And yet you have that great idea, like if I think the sky, the sun is shining, I don't then like focus on it and try to make the sun shine brighter. It's just like this passing thought. I think that's a brilliant way to kind of give an example of that's kind of how lightly we can deliver our
lightly, as lightly as possible, without losing that intent at all. You're basically just saying softly to the rest of you, this I would like this. And the rest of you says, that's a good project. We're going to take care of it, and we're going to make sure it's the best we can do. Take care of things that your conscious brain may not have any idea about. We'll take care of it, right?
I'm sure I remember listening to a podcast with a neuroscientist, I can't remember the name, but really saying something like only 3% of our what the brain's function is conscious. The vast I might not have got that statistic right, but it's a really tiny part of what the brain does is this conscious thing.
In terms of brain matter mass. Yeah, you look at a
brain function,
a picture of a brain, and you'll see the prefrontal cortex is this pretty small part, and then there's the whole rest of the brain. Then there's the spinal cord, which really is part of the brain, and then there's the entire peripheral nervous system, and that's a lot more than the and what the conscious brain is in terms of size. So what's going on here, and one way to describe this, it's a form of outsourcing, or you could even say insourcing, I suppose. The conscious brain, for this to work well, implicitly is outsourcing the implementation entirely, hopefully, to the rest of the system, which is perfect, which is waiting to hear this kind of good direction. And if you were to give yourself a nonsense direction, which is sometimes useful to test directions, like I'm green, the rest of you does just, oh yeah, he's just doing his thing. We're not even going to pay any attention to that. It's pretty sophisticated in that sense.
It's funny, I've used that with some people, and they actually have had what you might call somewhat positive results, just because they found it humorous, and that you know, when we smile or laugh, that has an effect on our
Oh, sure.
entire
Oh,
body nervous
absolutely. Yeah,
system.
yeah,
So,
right.
you know,
But as a testing technique for
yeah.
whether a direction is actually useful, which I
Hmm.
encourage all my students to do, because otherwise
Hmm.
I don't want anyone just going around thinking a thought because I told them to. They play with it. But that's what I really basically mean by inhibition, inhibiting this inhibiting the desire to implement. It's the implementation is kind of, that's kind of how we are typically sort of not wired up, but that's how we tend to do things. And in at least one form of inhibition, I suppose there are other ways of defining inhibition that are quite different. But I think in terms of inhibition and direction as sort of two sides of the same coin, really, that inhibition is just about actually allowing that system to work the way it's designed to and inhibit the temptation to help out in even the most subtle ways.
Yeah,
So,
I totally agree. And I'm also thinking, usually, and you said it yourself this way, that we think of inhibition and direction in that order. And it actually might
oh,
be inhibition, direction, inhibition.
I think I don't think you can, I wouldn't even think it's an order thing. I think
Yeah, I
it's
mean,
all,
I totally agree.
yeah.
But from when I was first learning it, it definitely, you know, is like, you know, stop, don't go with your habitual,
Mhm.
do your direct, you know, do your
Yeah, well,
direction.
one way to inhibit is to come to a complete stop, but more commonly, you're in the midst of an activity, you're in the midst of some perhaps self-direction, and it's right then that you also want to inhibit this temptation to help out. So to me, inhibition and good direction requires good inhibition. You have, the direction has to be a useful one. You know, it can't just be any old thing like, well, like I'm green or I'm purple. Not terribly useful directions, except for
Although if you
experiment.
personally find that they are very useful, go for
And go for it. Yeah,
it.
but I think most people are going to
Yes,
find
I'm
that
not
the
really.
humor will wear off pretty quickly.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So that's basically what I wanted to say about that topic. Do you have anything you want to add to this?
No, she says. um, just to bring it back to what you were saying about the outsourcing or the delegating, or
Right.
that whole idea is that that's what the inhibition is. You're letting your whole unconscious self take care of
Do,
things, and you see what happens when you do that.
and maybe there's a little element of patience,
Mm.
because it could be that you could come up with a direction and it might take a second or two for everything to kind of click in. Who knows? Although usually it's pretty quick. But if you jump in before it's had time to do what it would organically do, then
Mm-hmm.
you've short-circuited the process.
Mm.
And that's what would be good to inhibit.
Yeah, and then as you go along, you inhibit trying to help, and you inhibit trying to getting sucked into being interested in it, and all of that stuff, to just
Very
let it do it.
subtle, very
Yeah.
subtle ways of sneaking in there. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
Mm.
And I think everyone has their own subtle ways of doing it. And so sometimes you have to come up with a strategy for overcoming that. Because sometimes, like for example, I'll just give a quick example from my own experience when I started using freedom directions like my breathing is free, or even negative directions like I'm not breathing. And I would do that when I was lying down, getting ready to go to sleep. And suddenly my breathing would just go crazy, you know, and I was hard for me not to just get drawn into that. And I had to come up with sort of alternative strategies, typically using some other direction that wasn't directly a breathing one. Like I'm not lying on the bed or something like that. And even then it would, you know, I mean, I think it might almost be for some people, maybe some people can really just do it perfectly all the time. I think for most of us, it's kind of an ongoing, we slip back into some version of it and then we catch ourselves and,
Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's a good place to end. Well, my interviewer today has been Imogen Ragone, an Alexander teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. And I will put in the description of the video, and this will also be a podcast, a link to a blog I wrote some time ago called Not Even a Teeny Weeny Bit, that has all those quotes and some others, and really lays out how senior, you know, Alexander and first generation teachers approach this issue. So thank you for doing this, Imogen.
Thank you.